Before we dive in, here's another show you can enjoy in the True Story FM family of entertainment podcasts.
Okay, now for the lightning round.
I'm so good at lightning rounds. That's from Friends. It's my favorite show.
20 seconds on the clock starts now. Who is the captain of the USS Enterprise?
Oh, crap. Is it, Captain Stubing? No, Morgan? Crunch?
Next question. Which superhero is Tony Stark?
Stark. Did Game of Thrones have superheroes? I only watched 2 episodes.
What planet were Luke and Leia born on?
Planet Fitness?
Oh, time's up. Sorry. And now, a word from our sponsor.
Hey everybody, Mandy Kaplan here. Please check out my podcast, Make Me a Nerd, where each week an incredible guest tries to baptize this mainstream mom into the world of sci-fi, fantasy, and all things nerdy. Available wherever you podcast.
That's our show, folks.
Wait. I just thought of it. Padme Amidala gave birth to her twins Luke and Leia on Polis Massa. No, that's dumb. Is it Planet Hollywood?
Hey Pete, ever wonder what Steven Spielberg's favorite film is?
You know, Andy, I've heard he loves classics like Lawrence of Arabia, Meet Me in St. Louis.
Imagine chatting with him about why those films resonate with him so much.
That's exactly what we do on our podcast, Movies We Like. We've had incredible guests like actress Dee Wallace, cinematographer Eric Messerschmidt, director Steve Miner, and former Disney animators Tom and Tony Bancroft.
They share their favorite films and the impact they've had on their careers, offering fascinating insights into the craftsmanship and storytelling techniques that make these movies so special.
If you're curious about the magic behind the scenes, subscribe to Movies We Like from True Story FM on your favorite podcast app. New episodes are released on the 4th Monday of each month with early access for our members.
Join us on Movies We Like as we explore the movies we all like with the people who make them.
And Stephen, our people will call your people. Let's make this happen, Bubby.
Subscribe today.
Hello and welcome to listeners of both the Superhero Ethics and Star Wars Generations podcast. This is Matthew, your host for both of those. I'm sorry to say that this has been a really crazy week, and just this morning we found out that my grandfather had passed away, my spouse's grandfather, but he'd been a grandfather to me as well. As you can imagine, there's a lot going on, a lot of arrangements to be made, a lot of family stuff happening. And so I'm not going to be able to record episodes for either of these podcasts this week. And so I'm putting this out as my apology. I think we're going to have a older episode attached at the end of this as a rebroadcast, hopefully something you haven't heard before, because for those of you who are newer listeners or something that maybe you had heard quite a while ago but have forgotten and maybe think about differently today. So please enjoy. And again, my apologies. Thank you all so very much. We have spoken. Today on Superhero Ethics, we go where no podcast has gone before, into a land where 2 of the people on this podcast have blue or purple streaks in their hair, but not Mr. Hoppy. More importantly, we're talking about Star Trek and the nature of the frontier with Professor Matthew Kapell and Paul Hoppy and myself. All that and more after a commercial break we have no control over. Welcome back. I'm Matthew, your host. Use they, them pronouns. I'm joined, as fairly often, by my still stuck in the 21st century with no foreign color in his hair, co-host of Du Jour, Paul Hoppy. Paul, how you doing today?
I'm good, yeah. That's all I got. I'm good, yeah.
Okay, very verbose. Also joining me is another guest who I've recorded a podcast with already. We had audio problems. They may get rescued, but I'm really glad to have back again. Professor Matthew Kapell. Matthew is a professor of American Studies and Anthropology at Pace University in New York City. I got a great email a while ago now saying that he was a fan of the podcast, that he had some ideas about, looking at a lot of the stuff we talk about through the lens of mythology and storytelling and how these themes play into larger themes that are just a part. It just made my academic heart get so happy and made me realize I wanted Matthew on the podcast for as many episodes as we could. We have a lot of Star Wars content coming out now, so I said, hey, what can we do other than Star Wars? And he mentioned the Star Trek, because we can do both of them, Star Trek and the Frontier, and I thought this would be a fantastic topic. So, Matthew, so good to have you with us. Say hello.
Hello. Just to be clear, it was a fan letter, and I was not giving you suggestions.
I think you mentioned something like this is a cool, like somehow we got into the conversation. I will say that a lot of people have sent me fan letters, and they've turned into unknown solicitations to be on the podcast. But I'm very glad that you've done. I've enjoyed all of our conversations, and I think this is going to be a great one. So let me just kind of start by letting people hear a little bit more about you. Talk a little about your background in terms of the kind of stuff you teach about and how Star Wars and superheroes and the epic stories that we love and talk about on these podcasts kind of fit into the work you do.
Sure. So I'm a historian and anthropologist, though my doctorate's in American Studies. And I've done a lot of books in my career on science fiction film. And the reason I like science fiction film is because it's basically myth. It's the way we tell myth today. If you want to talk about any kind of myth, you have to start with Batman. You can't start with Zeus, right? And in that context, my PhD thesis had an entire chapter on the frontier in Star Trek. And that's why I brought it up with you. And it's very much a topic that is got ethical issues all around it, but as most of Star Trek does. So generally, I'm kind of semi-retired at this point. I basically just teach regular old-fashioned anthropology, things like urban ethnography, and American studies. I think I'm teaching a class in the fall on science and technology after World War II. So nothing special, very mythological, but all of my writing is in myth. So that's why I like you.
Nice. Well, I'm glad. It's such a great topic. I think I mentioned the other time we tried to record a podcast that the first time I thought seriously about Star Wars beyond just, being, I love the laser sword fights and things like that, was watching the Peter Campbell, and George Lucas talking about the power of myth and Star Wars. And since then, I've come to understand that there's a lot more to those ideas than what those two gentlemen had to say. For those of you not watching the stream, you didn't get to see Matthew kind of roll his eyes a bit when I mentioned that, because it is just one perspective of many, but it's such a rich field for discussing these things. And so let me just start by asking, so when we say the frontier, like that's, every Star Trek episode for a long time always opened with, space, the final frontier, or some version of it. The frontier was something I remember being taught about in American history, especially 19th century, that, it was always find the next frontier, American exceptionalism and all that. Talk about what does the frontier mean as a concept in American mythology?
Well, I think the easy place to start is to point out that for 3 or 4 generations, historians thought the frontier was a real thing that they were talking about as a historical artifact. But when the 1960s rolled around and people stopped thinking about history as the history of white men only, we came to the conclusion pretty quickly that our notion of the frontier was highly flawed. Not in terms of the frontier is bad, in terms of that's bad history. That's bad history writing. So because I'm an academic, I have come with quotes. Here's the quote you need. So America as a nation doesn't really have universities with history professors until like the 1880s. In fact, most of the disciplines we think of are 1880s to 1910. My field of anthropology is basically 1910. History, the first American Historical Association meeting is like 1884, maybe. Before the American Historical Association is even 10 years old, a historian from Wisconsin named Frederick Jackson Turner gives this stunningly important paper that we have been reading over and over and over again, even though we know he's wrong. And it's called The Significance of the Frontier in American History. And the famous quote, which I can almost do from memory, but I'm going to read just to be safe, is, up until our own day, American history has been, in a large degree, the history of the colonization of the Great West. And here it is. The existence of an area of free land, its continuous recession, and the advance of American settlement westward explain American development. That's 1893 in Chicago. we can take it apart, right? At free land, there was nobody there. Free land, right? It's this continuing colonization of this free land from the time of the Mayflower to 1893. And one of the things that Frederick Jackson Turner says in this 1893 talk is, but the frontier's gone now, and we've got to figure out something else. Because according to the Census Bureau, the frontier is done. Within 6 years of that, we're having the Spanish-American War looking for the next frontier. So this Frederick Jackson Turner was really good at doing something that academics like to do, used to like to do, and that was sending out reprints. So he did this talk, he published it, and he sent out hundreds of copies of it to important people throughout the United States. And people got excited to get shit like that in the mail. Stuff like that in the mail. Oh my God, a historian from Wisconsin really has an idea, and he sent it to me. And if there's like maybe one or two people that invent the idea of professional historians in the United States, and this is one of the guys. He's the guy who gets paid to be a historian by a university where he only teaches history. He was trained to be a historian, and that's what he does. And at the time, he sounds like a social scientist. Today, he sounds like a mythographer. At the time, he sounded like a political historian. Today, he sounds like somebody who's explaining how the myth of the frontier worked. And he did a really great job at that. And the frontier has been with us ever since. Between his talk and the New Deal, we're worried about the next frontier. By the time we get to the 1960s with Kennedy, we have the new frontier. Alaska's made a state, and its slogan is the last frontier. And I think Star Trek has some kind of frontier as well. And there's stuff after that too. So the frontier has been this thing that we cannot get away from. And
just hearing you say that, I can see what you mean about how it is such a dangerous part of the American kind of mythology. It's up there with the pulled up by your own bootstraps of, as Americans, it's our job not only to continually conquer the new frontier, to bring the American goodness to the West, and then going to the Spanish lands, and then going, you can see how it's just again and again been a thing. Paul, is this? You mentioned the Turner episode, the essay, and I was going to hopefully show off by mentioning it. I remember reading that in history class. Okay, so it's one of the only things I can remember from American history.
And the fact that you've read it is problematic because we stopped making students read it in 1960. So I want to go find your guy and tell her or him that this was a mistake. But anyway, Paul.
Unless it was read within a context that was aware of
yes.
that, which is possible.
Yeah,
given where you went.
There was a kind of historiography aspect to it, but yeah, Jeffrey Gunn, if you're listening, I have some questions about an essay I wrote on a midterm, and now another professor is backing me up. So, yeah, Paul, what for you? Do you have memories of this kind of idea of the frontier, or just kind of something you've thought about in general in your many praises of America that I know you're so fond of?
Yeah. I would say that, for all the failings of the education system that, I was incarcerated in for my youth, I think that actually the first school that I went to, Bank Street, from age 5 until 13 or 14, I think did a good job of being there were native people here, and first you're going to learn about that, and then you're going to learn about people showing up from the Netherlands, and then people showing up from England, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I do feel I was not taught this idea of the frontier being this great thing and American progress and all that. I do, the complaints that I have are that I think a lot of the way all this was taught was and that's what happened in the past, and now everything's much, much better. We've totally solved all these problems, and the idea racism is in the past or the South, that I'd say they let us down on, but I did feel there was some idea of the frontier being an idea and not like sort of like this great thing that happened and was conquered, like how the West was won, like that this was like some victory, right? I think it was like even from a young age, I feel like I was, told that it's like this wasn't a great thing that America did, and I appreciate that, And obviously I think we can probably still do better, but it's interesting, you're talking about space and, space, the final frontier and all that. Like space actually, the word kind of says a lot of it. Like there actually is space out there, right? There are many, many, many uninhabited planets. Earth is inhabited. It has been inhabited all over for a very long time. And so the idea of this frontier, it's like there were people there, right? There's animals there, like there were trees, like, and all of which, many got killed, right? Whereas the idea of something like colonizing Mars, for instance, it's like, well, maybe just everyone should move to Mars. Like, it's like there's, as far as we know, there's not life there, right? So right. If you were to go to that frontier, out into space, granted at some point, I think you probably would run into some form of life and probably some form of intelligent life that maybe wouldn't regard humans as particularly intelligent life. I don't know. But like space is more of it fits that mythology more than the reality fit that mythology, I think. Perhaps not within the context of Star Trek, where there's all these different, species and everything, and tons of planets are inhabited. As far as we know, it's like there's, there is actual space in space, and like you could go there and not be stepping on people who live there already.
The meme I keep getting is how Star Trek was written by white guys, and they're going where no one was gone before, and there's always people there.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, I think that's kind of what I was going to say is that, you're right. Like, actual space would make sense for this frontier mythology. One of the things I think that I think we're definitely going to talk about is that in Star Trek, it feels very much that same idea of the undiscovered country, which is the name of actually one of the better Star Trek movies, but still it always refers to the thing that hasn't been discovered by us. Right. And in the same way, it feels like for the frontier, it's that we, the white man, have not gone there yet. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And so that's probably a good way to jump into the Star Trek part of it. And actually, I'll start here with you, Paul, because I think you have not watched much Star Trek, correct?
Yeah, I've seen maybe like 5 to 8 of the movies of different eras, and then I've seen some episodes here and there of various different shows, and like halves of a bunch of episodes. But I haven't like sat down and watched a whole series of the television or like all the movies in order.
Right. So, which is good. I always like having someone who doesn't necessarily know the source material we're talking about it as much, just to kind of bring in that perspective in the conversation. So for you, when I like mentioned the idea that we're talking about of like Star Trek and the frontier, what comes to mind to you about like what that entails and what Star Trek and frontiers have to do with each other?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me like it is kind of an allegory for the mythology of the West, and it is about, as far as I can tell, it's about the Enterprise going out and stumbling upon different cultures that are already there, and then not interfering, but like, I don't know, they have some directives, and it seems to me like, yeah, it's not a bunch of just like open space, really, right? It's like there's a lot out there, and then there's wars or there's arguments and various different things, and I do feel like it probably is a show and movies or whatever, however you want to describe it, a universe that would probably appeal to a lot of my sensibilities, perhaps more than like Star Wars does, but it doesn't have laser swords. So, it just, I don't know. I never super grabbed onto it, but the idea of frontier is like, it's perspective, right? Like it doesn't have to be just like white men. It could be like the Klingons could have what they regarded as a frontier. And I mean, I think, is there something in the Star Wars, I mean, the Star Trek, like, I don't know if you call it mythology, but of like that a bunch of other species were aware of humanity, but was sort of like, no, we'll just leave them alone because like they're not quite like ready to interact with other like other cultures and species yet. Is that a thing in one of them somewhere?
There are a couple of episodes that play with that, but they never really folded into the overarching story very much. Okay. But like, here's a massively superior alien intelligence who's like, maybe when you're ready, we'll talk to you.
Right.
Yeah. There's a small version of it in that the Vulcans have an idea of they don't want to contact anybody until they become warp capable.
Oh, okay.
And so that's why one of the movies is all about them becoming warp capable in a way that the Vulcans will notice. And then once the Federation is around, that's kind of their bar of, until you become capable of warp speed, you're not on our level, and so we're going to see you as like, and it's framed in a very like, we're going to protect you kind of a way.
Right.
But it's very much a kind of like noble savage. You're the primitive. You're not worthy of our attention, but therefore also like, oh, that meteor is going to crash into your planet. Well, prime directive, we shouldn't interfere.
Right.
So things like that. So Matthew, tell us about what it like when I hear frontier. Like, there's a lot of thoughts I come up with, but for you, what does it mean to kind of look at these two things together?
Okay, so I'm going to say like two things, because Paul had this really good point. Maybe the Klingons have a frontier, right? Before Americans talk about the frontier, a frontier was a different kind of word. There was a frontier between France and Germany, and what they meant was this area that's not quite French and not quite German, and there's a cultural competition going on to see what it's going to be. The Pyrenees. Yeah, Alsace-Lorraine, or the Pyrenees.
Some of my ancestors were from there, so I was told about that.
So you could have grown up speaking French, you could have grown up speaking German, and that's what frontiers were. Actually, the Doctors Without Borders was founded in Paris. Their actual name is French, and it's not Doctors Without Borders, it's Médecins Sans Frontières. Right? And that kind of frontier is a different kind of frontier than we mean. The kind of frontier Americans talk about is the kind of frontier where we go and we discover economic opportunity and finally buy a farm. Yay. Right. There's a wonderful British scholar who talks about people's lawns and lawn care as the last gasp of frontiers for Americans. Right. But it's true. So there has to be like this idea of a frontier that's between us, the Federation, and Klingons, as well as the frontier of empty space. I wish there was more empty space, but then again, I wish there was warp. Still, okay, here's another quote I brought, because here's the Star Trek doesn't want to do this thing, but they really do it. There's this great book from the 1830s called Westward Ho, and it is by a guy whose name is James Kirk Pauling.
That name has some significance in a Star Trek kind of way.
Kind of does. And here's what he says about traveling west. He says, no matter where he goes, Eastern European males, no matter where he goes to whatever region, he carries within his destiny, which is to civilize the world and to rule it afterwards. That is American frontier racism in a nutshell. I mean, it's perfect. And it's James Kirk Pauling. Yeah. Yes, please go.
Well, I was saying, it's funny because I know that like when Gene Roddenberry was marketing the show and trying to get people to buy into it, like the phrase that he used that's now quite famous is it's wagon train to the stars. Yeah. And so it's meant to be like a Western exploring show. But I hadn't really put together until you said that, like just how deep that it's not just about the idea of going to explore new things, but it's about this idea of carrying the Federation exceptionalism now instead of American exceptionalism, but it's the same idea, carrying that out to everyone. And it's funny because in that way, and as a historian, you can tell me if I'm wrong here, it does feel like in that extent, America is exceptional in that it's the exception. It's different, not that it's better, but that like the French wanted an empire, but there was a sense of like the borders of France with some joshing around with the lines between Germany or Spain or Italy, but like the lines of what is France have been established for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Same with all these other countries. The idea of like that America is a thing that has to be continually expanded and, our divine providence to manifest destiny and all that, that is a thing that is exceptional to the United States. Am I correct on that, or at least somewhat?
Somewhat, yeah. I mean, the French for a while thought Algiers was part of France, right? But yeah, go back to the Northwest Ordinance. What the United States did shortly after the beginning of the constitutional period was say, here's this new area that goes all the way to where you're at, Matthew, Minnesota, north of the Ohio, and here's how they can create new states. And those states, when they're admitted to the Union, will be entirely and completely equal to the existing states. That was the new thing. So yeah, it was a mistake with Ohio, but every place else, they're like, okay, Indiana, you are just as good as Massachusetts, right? And that was relatively unique. The other thing that was really unique about it was they said, when you create townships, you have to sell part of it to create schools. And that was also very unique for the time period. To say, okay, every township is going to be 36 square miles, and right in the middle, you're going to have a chunk that is going to be sold exclusively to finance schools, public schools for the population of this new township. That was also really new. The idea of both of those things. So yeah, I mean, every nation is exceptional, though, right? There's
and it's the idea that this specific thing about America is exceptional. Yeah, and that last part, when I lived in Wisconsin, they like to point out the land grant thing because the main historical result of that, at least according to people in Wisconsin, where this is very important, is Big Ten college football. That's another thing. But let's pull it back to. Go ahead.
I just want to respond as a trivia enthusiast. Do you know what country actually has the most time zones?
Russia.
France. France has something like 13 time zones because actually all of those places are regarded as part of France.
Oh, because like French Samoa and things like that.
So they might not actually be, conceptualized that way, but certainly in a legal sense, they are actually France. And thus it has like 13 time zones or something absurd compared to like China's one, which is
because I know like with the British Empire, for example, like they were always very clear, like this is all British territory, but it is not Great Britain.
Right. Exactly. England. It's different that way. Russia is the largest contiguous number of time zones or something like that.
Right.
But
that makes sense.
But France actually has like 13. So.
All right. Pulling it back to Star Trek, though.
Leave it to France.
Yeah. It's interesting, though, especially because, and I think in many ways, Star Trek is, I think for good reason, often regarded as being a fairly progressive show for its time always. But today there's a lot of stuff on the more modern Star Trek shows have characters of color and women characters and transgender characters all in very important roles. It's really pushing the boundaries of a lot of kind of interesting social issues it's talking about. And so I often think about it that and even the show from the 60s, it's clearly being very critical of, Jim Crow and the anti-civil rights culture, or the Vietnam War. And so I think of it as being a show that is very critical in progressive liberal ways of the existing culture of America in the 60s. But to me, this is such a great example of just the bias that always happens there, is that even from that perspective, we weren't challenging the idea of the frontier as the great liberal, as that there's something wrong or racist about it, because it's baked into Star Trek, like you said, from the very beginning.
It's baked into America.
That too.
Maybe the strength of Star Trek is not that they just wholeheartedly accepted the idea of the frontier, but that they tried to take it and twist it to their own ends. That was a much more woke version of the frontier. Right? You can't get rid of pick a world religion, but you can change the way we think about that religion as a believer. We're not going to get Americans to stop thinking the frontier is where America became great. But maybe if we talk about that greatness in a different way, we'll get something.
So what do you think of how and this is kind of a very broad question, we get into more specifics, but kind of taken overall, how do you feel like Star Trek has wrestled with the concept of the frontier?
Okay, so poorly.
Fair.
Yeah, but increasingly not. So initially, the original Star Trek, which I watched when I was writing my PhD, but just because I had to, is very liberal in many wonderful ways, but it also still has many skirts, right? It's a product of its time. Nobody says Napoleon was a bad general because he didn't have an air force. But when they went places, quite often they were just meeting people that were inferior to them and fixing them. And that is a notion of American frontier ideology straight up. Since that moment, they've stepped further and further away from the frontier every chance they get. I was just thinking about the most recent J.J. Abrams one, where they go out to the frontier and they find the bad guy, and it turns out he was a human the whole time, because the bad guy can't be the other. So instead, we're just ignoring the fact that there's a frontier. And I think that's the general trend of Star Trek, which was to keep saying final frontier, but become more and more about globalization than anything. Right? So by the time you get to Next Generation, it's great powers talking to each other. And now, I don't even know what to call it now. It's very much not about a historical narrative. They try to avoid it in any way they can. I guess the new one, Strange New Worlds, is less like that. But they're fully aware now that if they talk about the frontier too much, they're going to come off bad. So instead, they try to avoid talking about the frontier. Except for the voiceover at the beginning. It's, we've met these new people, and aren't they great? It's like middle school diversity day. These people are different. Yay, that's great. The end. Right? Yeah, and that's Star Trek now. Which is a critique, but not a critique that I hold in my heart very well. Just to be clear.
Do you think there's room for basically like confronting it more head on within the sort of mythology of Star Trek, of having more nuance?
Yes, I think there is. I don't think they're going to do so.
Okay,
I don't think it's a saleable script.
Right.
Right. I totally think that the current group of creators would be very capable of doing it.
Right. They just wouldn't get the funding.
But they are totally professionals who would like to get renewed. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Well, it's interesting because I do think that in some ways, especially some of the newer stuff, and we're going to have spoilers here for all the seasons of Discovery. I have not watched Strange New Worlds yet, but if you need to spoil that, go right ahead. There is more and more of we have met someone else and realized that they are superior to us, and we have to learn from them. And it's interesting because I feel like it's a story that is a critique of frontierism, that's now about how do we explore to learn about our failings and to learn what do others out there know that we don't yet. And that is, I feel like in some ways, a kind of fundamentally, it is the critique you're talking about, but you're right, it's not connected to it at all. Then no one ever says that no one ever uses that language of exploring to find where we're different or to find something else. It's just that language of the frontier has gone away entirely.
Yes, very much. I think that's okay. So, it's best not to be overly explicit. You're not going to make a show that is so very American as Star Trek without being American. To me, the concern is the more popular Star Trek becomes internationally, I think the more Americanized the planet is becoming, and that's problematic, right? When people in Bali are really excited for the new Star Trek, I'm terrified.
Because you think it's another way of sort of spreading frontier propaganda?
Yeah. we might as well be selling them jeans and Elvis Presley.
Which is already happening, right?
Yes.
And it's like it's another
right.
element in that, right? But I do think there's something to be said for like selling the mythology as opposed to just like the goods, kind of, right? Like and I don't know. I mean, do you think that's something that comes with the material things as well? Like when a McDonald's goes somewhere or a Walmart opens somewhere, that kind of brings some of the sort of like American mythology as much as just like, the deforestation-based hamburgers or whatever, like.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's a reason. One of the biggest employers of anthropologists in the world is Target Corporation.
Wow, really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
They do everything from figuring out what to put on end caps by watching people behave in stores to figuring out, I guess there's like 3 Target layouts, figuring out how those Target layouts work for areas, for specific subcultures. So, that's what anthropology has become.
So then can you learn about a place by looking at its target? I know I'm like way off the...
No, it's yes, you can. I did my doctorate overseas, and so there were no Targets. And I got there shortly after, I guess, Woolworths had gone out of business, so there was not a Woolworths, not that I'd ever been to one.
Yeah.
So they had their own local stores, and I learned more about the city I lived in from the stores I had to go buy sheets at, and a very like in my guts kind of way, right?
I don't know if this is still true, but I know for a while the Wall Street Journal had as one of the things it considered a leading like sign of foreign economic activity was based on the price of a Big Mac in the capital city of every country in the world, because there is a McDonald's in the capital city of almost every country in the world. We're exploring the frontier of this topic, which is why it's okay that we're kind of wandering off on tangents.
Nice.
Tangents are now the frontier.
Yeah.
And I think it's such an interesting question because it's something like Star Trek. I think there is this like one of the things that comes up a lot in the kind of media criticism that we do on this podcast is this idea of how do you wrestle with, stuff that is, where you feel there's a lot of good things in a story or an actor or whatever, but that parts of it are also problematic. And what do you do with, all the feelings about this? I feel like Star Trek it creates sort of a new version of this problem, because what Star Trek is doing is trying to keep alive the story of something that was originally told, now, I'm bad at math, 60 years ago. And it continue, and like the writers are clearly aware of the problem of it originally. Like, I think if you started a new Star Trek today, like without using the word Star Trek, a new version of it, you'd maybe want to like disconnect from the frontier idea entirely. But it seems like part of what Star Trek has been doing is like, okay, we recognize that in the 60s we told this kind of story and the women were all in these kind of roles, and that's bad. So how do we change that? How do we maybe not have it be all white people who are in command and all this stuff? But you're still beholden to the past. And as you said, the frontier is so integral to Star Trek. So I think it's just something really interesting there about how this show has tried to kind of like be aware of that while also not entirely cutting itself off from its past.
I would agree with that. I think it's important to defend Star Trek from the simple perspective that you can't avoid the frontier if you want to talk about something that's Americanly cultural, right? Another anthropologist, a guy named Conrad Kotak, used to write in his intro textbook that Star Trek was a retelling of the Thanksgiving myth. It was a multicultural get-together in one place where people figured out how to live together. And he thought that was a significantly important thing about the idea of Thanksgiving and Star Trek, and he put them right together. And I think that's kind of true. So the fact that we all had that same history growing up where they used to be racist and they're not, and they used to be sexist and they're not. Well, Star Trek used to be a little racist and a little sexist, and they're trying not to be. They're still giving us that same kind of history we had in like 6th grade. but at least they're trying. It's not like they're saying you can't teach the bluest eye in your high school lit class.
Oh, like when people look back at stories that are told today that people think of as like some of the more enlightened stories, you know, or things that are certainly trying hard to like understand the world as it is and to be considerate of all different sorts of people and, you know, maybe animals, usually not. But like, I think people will look back and be like, oh, well, you know, they tried, you know, and they did better than other people were doing at that time. And there's an extent to which like we're all, you know, trapped by our own perspective, where we can always try to expand our perspective. We can always try to learn more and understand more and not make judgments based on, you know, a lack of information, but like still we only know what we know, right? And so I think there always is going to be some reflection later that looks back and is like, oh, well, we probably could have done better, you know, but of even the stuff that's ahead of its time, right? Like, I mean, I think Star Trek of the 60s could be described as ahead of its time, maybe not ahead of our time, but a lot of things now are still behind whatever the times will be at some point, hopefully, you know, if there is something that we'd like to consider progress, right? And it sounds like sometimes like when you make something, it's like, I don't know, one of my concerns about having like so many Batman stories and so many Star Wars stories and like Marvel stories and Star Trek stories is like, there is an extent to which it's like, these things were created when they were created. There are things about when they were created that are integral to the story, to the mythology, right? And like you're not going to just like make Batman not a billionaire. Like you could. You could, and I think there's a story that does that. And my understanding is it's a fairly interesting tale. But he probably was a billionaire and then lost his money and whatever, you know. And not like that happens. That'll happen. But like, there's so many stories now, like everything, especially like these big like tentpole films, they always want to be based on some IP that's already been proven to be successful in some lower risk format like print, right? Or it's like, oh, well, they already made it, so like now we can spin that off into something successful. And I think it makes it very difficult to like, what you end up getting is this, like, either you keep doing what you were doing or you like change things, but then in a way that sometimes is like frustrating to people who liked the original thing. And it's not saying you shouldn't do that, but it's like, I don't know. I just like to see more like new media that's like, oh, I had an idea. Let's make this story, you know, and then maybe not have a 1,000-piece expanded universe. You know, I say this while podcasting on like Star Wars Universe podcast and like, you know, commenting on things like that. But I think it's something that is hard to get away from when like there are roots in some story. It's like it's, you know, it's in there, and I don't know.
I think with Star Trek now, though, saying we shouldn't have more Star Trek or more Batman is the same thing as saying we shouldn't have another lawyer show. I mean, right. It's a genre unto itself at this point. Let's be clear, much of Star Trek sucks. Much of Batman sucks. Most of Batman sucks. Sorry. But also, another point to make is, and you can tell me this is an inappropriate way of putting it, but we're essentially three mostly white, mostly American, mostly enculturated male guys talking about Star Trek. I noticed with a bunch of my friends, when Nichelle Nichols died, they all showed the same image from an episode of the original series on their feeds, and it had never occurred to me that this was an important moment. There's a moment in one of the episodes where somebody gets called away from the bridge, and Nichelle Nichols' character is told to like sit down at the navigator's post. And to this day, Black American nerds freak out about that one moment because it's so inconsequentially normal when it happens. And I don't think we would have noticed it that way. So, yeah, it's important to remember that perhaps our perspective is narrow in that context, right? But it's also the thing Paul said that's really key is maybe we were not in a place to look back at Star Trek and go, they're not as good as they could have been if it hadn't been for Star Trek pushing us in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, I've recently been reading Jane Austen, and what I should say, I sound more cultured than I am. I've been watching a lot of adaptations of Jane Austen stuff, and they're wonderful. And clearly, she was, for her time, or even for today, making incredibly needed feminist critiques of the culture that ring true today. She was also talking about the utter tragedy that would befall a young woman if she had to go from being upper class to being upper middle class, and the deprivations that occur when you move into a house of only 2 servants. So, there's always that. But I think the point about perspective that you make is also so important. And it is one where I do think Star Trek is also really pushing things forward, is that, and some of the other things we're doing this is too, certainly Marvel I think is getting better at this, and I want DC to get better at it as well, is trying to say, okay, well, let's take that same story of the frontier, or let's take the same story of the billionaire, or whoever it is, but let's tell it from a new, not only tell it about new people, but have new people tell the story. And I know my understanding is that the writers' room for Discovery has been much more diverse than it has been in the past. Certainly, a lot of the kind of Marvel stuff, they're getting women writers of color, queer writers, things like that. And I don't know if this is like a complete bastardization of the term, but I wonder, is there some room for the idea that is, or am I just being a horrible American here? That's the next frontier we could talk about with this kind of stuff, is the frontier of not pushing into new space, but pushing into new ideas and pushing into, well, I mean, if I start to say pushing into more people having the ideas or sharing the ideas, then yes, it is the exact frontierism, but now it's like, let's go out and colonialize their ideas. That's so maybe I've just talked myself out of it. Someone should jump in and rescue me from this idea pretty quickly. But
maybe the idea of a frontier is this is a metaphorical way of talking about opportunity, and the new frontier is to extend opportunity to broader classes of people, which is a thing I think that's a part of it, but I'm more we're supposed to be doing.
What I more mean is the thing of like the Orville, which I will to my dying day defend the idea that the Orville is a Star Trek show. It is not officially licensed by Star Trek, but it is 100% a love letter to it. For those who don't like Seth MacFarlane humor, there's a lot less of that after the first season. But that show is one thing I think that show is doing so well, that Star Trek did so well for so long, and still is doing in some ways, is the idea of, okay, well, we're used to this kind of racism. Let's go to a world where there's a whole new idea of what race could look like. Or, like, in the Orville, there's a planet that is all male, theoretically, but there's some questions about that. Or, like, Star Trek has done a lot more with not ambidextrous, my brain is being dumb, but ambi about gender, androgynous cultures, where or cultures where genders can shift. I guess that was more what I meant, is the idea of saying, like, can we push new ideas in new ways and, like, ask us to think about the concepts in our own world differently by showing us the possibility of something that's fundamentally different but of those same questions. And maybe that's not a frontier at all. Maybe that's something entirely different.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I have like 3 or 4 things lodged in my brain that I'm trying to like be like, okay, I wanted to say this and this and this. To this point, I think, I mean, like, knowledge is a frontier, right? But it's also like, it's a frontier from a perspective, because like that information theoretically maybe exists, or like somebody knows something, right, but like maybe you don't. So that's like your own sort of frontier of discovery. But but yeah, I mean, it does seem like it's kind of just a metaphor, it's like the undiscovered or the unknown, but it's like, people have been having a lot of ideas for a long time. Just it's more a lot about like who gets the opportunity to tell those ideas in the $200 million budget, or even just a published novel, and I do think that there is certainly more opportunity for more people now than there used to be, Also, I wanted to clarify, I wasn't saying I don't think there should be any more Batman stories. I don't think there should be any more Star Trek stories. I think there should be a lower percentage of stories that are based on previously existing media. I think there still should be some. You make a great character, fine. Keep making new stories with that character. Cool, no problem. But also make some more new characters more frequently, and invest in those characters as well. It's not like it doesn't happen. It happens less than I think would be ideal. And I think when you do, then you have more people have the opportunity to create their own characters as opposed to trying to adapt some other character to their sort of view. I also wanted to mention what BuffyBot said in the chat, which was kind of similar to what you're talking about. And then Nichelle Nichols, who played Uhuru in the original Star Trek and recently died, was apparently she was thinking of leaving after the first season, and she was talking to Martin Luther King, who was look, this role might not seem like a huge deal to you, but it's a big deal to a lot of people, that your character isn't the captain, right? But she is in a position of authority and a position that, people didn't see black women in TV and in media in those positions at that time. And obviously still we could do better, right? And hopefully that is going in that direction. But it's that probably helped us get to where we are now to some extent.
Whoopi Goldberg has talked often about how the first time she thought of becoming an actress was when she was a young child and saw the show. And she talked to her mother because it was the first time she'd ever seen a black woman on TV or on screen who wasn't a maid. And that really meant a lot to her. But at the same time, there's some great creators I was reading recently, black women creators, talking about how the character it was fantastic to see a black woman in that role. But in terms of it was a woman surrounded by men basically as the secretary, the glorified secretary, and so raising some interesting points there. What you say though also lets me, first of all, I'll say I appreciate what you're saying about the kind of the different perspectives, because even as I was saying it, I was realizing the idea of pushing into other new planets or ideas that have different ideas about race or gender, the binary system of gender is very much a sort of Western conception. So even there's a great example of that. And part of what gets me thinking, and I don't know about this much, but I wonder, Matthew, if you do, Star Trek I know is very definitional to sort of on-screen science fiction. So is Star Wars, although Star Wars is not science fiction, but that's, in terms of the... Exactly. But I feel if I think about it, I see this frontier idea so often in science fiction, in media, especially on TV and the like. I don't know much about science fiction that's being created outside of American or even kind of Western concepts. I've read a good deal about Afrofuturism, for example. I've not had a chance to read much of it. I'm curious if you have much experience of sort of the science fiction that's being written outside of particularly Western, colonizer mythologies, and if we're seeing science fiction without a frontier idea being created in spaces where the frontier isn't a part of their mythology, isn't a part of their sort of national thinking. Right.
Well, so here's the thing. When we talk about science fiction, we're really just talking about American science fiction. Because everything we think of as science fiction is really just American science fiction. Even Jules Verne was not particularly frontier-y. More and more science fiction creators are working to ignore the traditions of American science fiction. But there's others that just never got exposed to it, really. There's a huge wealth of stuff coming out of China finally getting translated now. I'm thinking of the novel The Three-Body Problem, which is an amazing science fiction novel that starts during the Cultural Revolution in China in the 1960s and deals with first contact, and it's just beautiful. And At no point is there a frontier. In fact, if there is a frontier, it's really dangerous. And we have to do everything we can to make sure nobody notices us or they will come and destroy us. I mean, that's the final summation of the story. If the aliens find us, they will come and kill us. That's why we never hear people when we're searching for extraterrestrial intelligence, because no actual interstellar intelligence is going to let us survive, because they know it's a threat to them if they do. So everybody gets killed. And that is so not American science fiction. It's kind of ridiculous, right? Because American science fiction is so tied up in the frontier, and it always has been. I don't know, the John Carter movie was not as bad as people said, but the books it was based on from the early 20th century are these great little Edgar Rice Burroughs books. They're like Tarzan on Mars, and they're just fantastic. And they have red people and they have Greek people, and they talk about them in completely racist and sexist ways, because it's 1920. But it's very American. It's very much the Virginian goes to Mars. No Chinese science fiction is like that. No Afrofuturist science fiction is really like that. And we have American science fiction writers who refuse to deal with frontier ideology. They just refuse, and they're writing much better stuff. N.K. Jemisin won the Hugo 3 years in a row for writing essentially books about African myth. Put in a science fiction context.
It's fun. I'm embarrassed now. I can't remember the name of the person who.
Traditionally American.
Octavia Butler wrote Parable of the Sower, right? Okay, so I did remember. Yeah, I mean, those books are some of my favorite science fiction. And yeah, I hadn't even thought of them in those terms, but they're very much about turning inward to community and community building and what that looks like, instead of this idea of sort of pushing outward into a frontier mythology.
I feel like... Oh, I was just going to say, I feel like what I know of, Japanese science fiction from animation doesn't seem particularly frontier-related. Like, even Cowboy Bebop, which is, it's not on Earth. It's it's in the solar system, and it's not about encountering new races of people or new species or new cultures. It's about, they are literally colonizing the various different planets in the solar system, but again, there weren't people there before, so it's different than American frontier, and the stories aren't really about that, right? They're much more inwardly focused and kind of kind of noirish, and so I do feel I kind of hear what you mean about American science fiction and having this kind of theme that seems to be very pervasive, but that doesn't seem like it's everywhere, right? In all kinds
Cowboy
of
Bebop,
science fiction.
That seems like it's very much just about the same kind of stories we're telling now, except now instead of getaway cars, we've got getaway spaceships and some laser guns every now and then. But it's very similar kind of storytelling.
But it does something that is also really cool, which is it decides which things from American sci-fi it wants to use, and it uses them the way it wants to. And it just takes them and uses them. It doesn't take them and use them without thinking about them. It examines them carefully and then uses them.
Do you have any specific examples? We talked about in kind of general terms, but are there any specific examples of Star Trek movies or TV or episodes that you think are kind of a particular illustration of either positive or negative uses of, or positive or negative interactions with this frontier idea?
Well, if you, in a general context, think about how many times people in Star Trek have to deal with the 19th century somehow. There's an episode of the original series where they have to refight the OK Corral fight. There's an episode with Abraham Lincoln. There's a number of episodes of Next Generation that take place in the 19th century. They go meet Mark Twain at one point, who's played by the guy who played Data. And he does a good job because he's a pretty good actor. Star Trek goes to other times, to say Wales and whatnot. But they go to the 19th century a lot because the 19th century is where the frontier is. And it fits. So when I think about refighting the OK Corral or going to see Mark Twain in The Next Generation, I think that's very Star Trek. They also get, though, they get the other problem that you, Matthew, talked about earlier, which is when they do go elsewhere, sometimes they need something that cannot be understood. And if there's a trend in Star Trek, it's to then figure out how to fix that problem. So when we first meet the Borg in The Next Generation, they're the example of completely incomprehensible other. Since then, they've become more and more comprehensible and understandable because they become more human. The new series, Strange New Worlds, is doing the same thing with the Gorn, the lizard people that Kirk fights. They're completely incomprehensible. And that's why they're interesting. But at least I think the new series, Strange New Worlds, understands what it's doing. Paul, you were going to say something?
Is that a problem that you feel the writers are attempting to solve, or that the characters are attempting to solve within the context of the story, or not really a problem, but something that the writers are then kind of going away from after doing this interesting thing to try to make it easier for the viewer?
I don't think I think we have to put it in capitalistic terms again, right? So you invent this great villain, and this villain is great, and everybody loves this villain. So you got to write another story with this villain, but you've got to have more of the villain for the viewer to get. So the Borg, and the first time you meet them is like for 4 minutes, and they're just like automatons, and now when we talk about the Borg, we're like, they're led by a queen, it's a hierarchical society, because every new episode that featured them had to make them more understandable, otherwise there was no story to tell. And in the telling of stories, you're always going to make them more understandable. But if the frontier is really about
one of the biggest problems in science fiction, especially Star Trek, I love the Borg originally, but it's hard to tell a story about something that is out of your context. And so, they give it the Borg queen, and by the way, she's sexy and seductive, and like it's fun to watch her flirt with Data, but to me, it took away a lot of the mystery of the Borg. And a similar thing, I was thinking about this way back, but like, to me, one of the fundamental problems Star Wars has always had, and in some ways it's I'm going to mix up Star Wars and Star Trek. I do it when I'm talking about Star Wars, so it goes both ways at least. Star Trek in theory is about this completely moneyless society. But the writers keep realizing how much of the conflict in our own world, in our media, in our narratives, is about money. If you take money completely off the table, it's really hard to find stories to tell. So now there's stories about, you need credits to use the replicator. It's not money, but still, I can offer you my replicator credits to ask you to do this thing, or I can bet this thing. And in some ways, I feel like Star Wars got a lot better when it introduced the Ferengi, who are... The Ferengi had a lot of problems originally. They were not great villains by any means. But by the time of of Deep Space Nine, through the Ferengi, you've brought capitalism and monetary exchange back into the Star Trek universe. And I was always sort of torn because I think it made for very good storytelling, or at least storytelling I could relate to a lot more. But also now I want storytelling in a world that has no money. But I also know it's hard for me to comprehend, and so it's very hard for someone to write for me. And that's kind of the tension I think that you get there a lot.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's why they have to break the Prime Directive so much.
Yeah.
You got to have conflict somehow. And if it's not going to be money, it's got to be something else. And all of our narratives are about money.
Although
that's why Bruce Wayne is a billionaire.
I was saying, I went back and did some checking. He's not a billionaire in the original comics. He's a multi-millionaire. So inflation.
Ursula.
But sorry, go on. Yeah,
he's a millionaire. Yeah.
$1 million.
He'll have to be a trillionaire in Batman Beyond then. But.
In much the same way that Star Trek can't escape the frontier, stories from Star Trek or all science fiction can escape capitalism. It's the same thing. It's the same idea. The frontier was about opportunity to make money. And Star Trek has never been able to avoid that problem. Right? Ursula K. Le Guin has that famous quote. She was at the National Book Awards in a room full of like Amazon execs getting an award, and she said about capitalism, she said, "You can't imagine a world without capitalism. Remember, 2 centuries ago, nobody could imagine a world without the divine right of kings." And but Star Trek still has not imagined a world without capitalism, because they can't. Yeah. Because then there's the problem with Star Trek has always been, how do you have tension between characters? Right? So instead,
I feel like.
Sorry, go, Paul.
Oh,
and
no,
so instead,
I was just going to say. No.
Right. Instead, they have the tension about political ideologies. Can we interfere with this culture? Is the only tension they can have. Paul, go.
I do feel like there are so many conflicts that people find a way to have, though, with one another, you know. But that is a challenge of, especially like a TV show, right? A movie, you're like, okay, I'm going to make this one movie, I'm going to come up with a conflict, we're going to build the whole story around it, boom, we're good, right? But like a TV series, like, oh man, they used to do like 20 some episodes a season, right? Like, this is a lot of conflicts to come up with, and like you need your A plot, your B plot, like it's a lot of stuff. And I mean, I do think there's plenty of things. I mean, also I'll just throw in a little like writing thought is like I think the idea that like all writing stems from conflict, or all drama, or like that all good stories have to be firmly rooted in conflict, I think is absolutely not true. And I think there are other modes of storytelling, and you know, they might not be as, you know, capitalistically successful as easily, but like you can tell stories that don't have that much conflict. It's doable, you know. Yeah. But I do think Hollywood and a lot of storytelling is addicted to conflict, and just money's what people know, right? And it's like, I think writers and viewers and executives have such a hard time being like, okay, let's let go of, just totally put away this one sort of like vector of conflict, and then we have to think about what's left, right? And it's, if you're trying to do 20 some episodes a year, it's like that's pretty hard. But like, I don't know. I feel like you could do it, but maybe if they did 3 episodes a year,
or the globalization of media, you know, gives me some hope.
Could do it a little
Paul,
more
I think you're right.
I don't know.
Right now, Hollywood is not going to take some, you know, Ugandan or, you know, Paraguayan, you know, author and give them $500 million to make a story about a science fiction story written that outside of the American context. But we're seeing more and more TV shows start to really explore those things. One of my partner, Mary, has really gotten into a TV show. I believe it's called Untamed, but it's basically is a epic fantasy story with, you know, like different warring houses and sword fighting and magic set in China. And it's told by, you know, it's made by Chinese creators, and it's, you know, about China, the way like Lord of the Rings is kind of very much like, you know, drawn out of Western, you know, German and English mythology. This is very much drawn out of Chinese mythology in various ways. It also has an awful lot of wonderful gay content, which is a great thing about that show in particular that I recommend. But like, there's a number of these shows being made now. And so it does give me some hope that I would love to see some, like, you know, Netflix Africa, or hopefully not Netflix at all, but like some, you know, TV company start to you know, let's see Afrofuturism on, you know, as a TV show made in Nigeria or somewhere else like that. Because I love that it's happening in print, but I do think that the mass media is still always going to be on screen, and it's not that I think at the end point, I'm never going to wind up saying, okay, this is better because it doesn't have the frontier. But I think the more we get to watch TV, science fiction that doesn't have the frontier, it allows us to see how much the frontier is a part of Star Trek. And not that it's necessarily bad. Like, I love Star Trek, and I think Star Trek has great ethical content. But yeah, I think you're really doing a good job of highlighting how much the frontier is baked in, and I feel like getting to see other things outside of that context would really help highlight that.
Yeah. I think like Netflix actually has done a good job of broadening their sort of sourcing of shows, right? At least, and maybe movies as well, where they're, I mean, I watch, most of what I watch is from Spain or Mexico, you know, and like, cause I like to watch my fiction in Spanish, cause then I feel like I'm studying or something, but like, it's, you know, it is interesting seeing different shows made in different places that, you know, have sensibilities that are somewhat different than most of the shows you'll see that are made in the United States or in, I mean, for that matter, like if you just watch English shows or movies compared to like American ones, there's a difference, or Canadian comedies. It's like, I mean, I think like Kim's Convenience and like Schitt's Creek, like, they play with that sort of not having conflict exactly the same way you would have in most American sitcoms, right? Like some things will just end up not being a big deal that you're like, this would definitely be the big embarrassing conflict at the end of an American sitcom.
One of the things that you never, it's funny because it's the absence of something, so it's hard to notice at the time.
It's fine.
But the writers have said, they were very explicit about this. You know, one of the main characters is gay, and gay romance is a big part of the show. Homophobia never occurs in the show. Like it is never a source of conflict there. And even like there's a problem with the parents, but it has much to do with like just the cultural, like the parent, I think the parents of one are more kind of small town and have some issues with like the big cityness of the other partner. But like they made a very conscious decision of, we wanted to tell stories about a queer character for whom homophobia was never going to be a source of drama. And it's amazing to say that that's revolutionary, but it was revolutionary, you know? And in the same way, people are saying, like, you know, for a while, if you had a woman action hero or superhero, so often her story was built out of, you know, sexual violence happening to her or someone in her life, and thus acquiring power to fight back about that. And people being like, no, stop, let's stop having that story. Right.
Yeah, and it's not even that you can like never tell the story. It's just like, don't always tell the story. Whatever the story is, like tell different stories. And like when there's something that's such a low-hanging source of conflict, it's like, you know, it's like, oh, should we do that one? Yeah, let's do that one. You know, I mean, there's a reason that there's like websites about like TV tropes, right? And it's like, oh, it's this trope. Oh, it's that trope. Like, there's just like, you know, a list of things. Oh, we'll do one of those episodes that like, you know, we'll do one of the episodes where somebody gets like one volume of the encyclopedia and then they know all the words that start with a V or a P or whatever. Like, you know, I mean, there's a lot of ideas. There's a lot of sources of conflict. You don't always have to go to the like really low hanging ones, particularly when they're ones that like, you know, echo traumatic events that many people have experienced, right? Like maybe back away from those completely for a while, and then you can sprinkle them in occasionally if you want, but doing it in a conscious way, but like just not always the thing, whatever the thing is, whether the thing's the frontier or, you know, homophobia or violence or anything like that.
Or criminal law.
Or criminal law, exactly.
I mean, if there's American shows tend to be, or you can do 42 minutes in any American show about two people not communicating effectively in the first 5 minutes of the show.
If you hang out with any group of polyamorous people and talk about media, one of the first things that will come up, I think a lot of people, monogamous or anything, can be sick of the love triangle trope. But hang out with polyamorous people and talk about love triangles, and the like, why doesn't she just date both of them? Is a concept you're going to hear a lot, you know? Because I think especially when you're, those tropes feel all the worse when you're sort of living out the like it doesn't have to be this way. Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. I want to kind of give us both everyone a chance to kind of say last words and then start to wrap up. Yeah. Matthew, is there any kind of big parts of this we haven't covered, or any kind of quotes or other points you wanted to make before we start to wrap up?
Hey, you know what? I actually do have a quote. 1960, Kennedy gets elected, and he's going to send people to the moon. Yay. He doesn't know he's going to do it. He's going to be inaugurated in the end of January 61. He gets a science advisor. He's the first president to get a science advisor, a guy named Jerome Wiesner, who's the president of MIT, an engineer, who did an entire committee report on what we should do in the space program. And one of the things he said was, probably no matter what, we're going to go. So the question is, how are we going to go? And the quote from that report given to Kennedy before he's even sworn in as president is this, about humans in space. Given his enormous curiosity about the universe in which he lives and his compelling urge to go where no one has ever been before, this will be done. 1961. We're talking zeitgeist stuff. And the fact that Star Trek interrogates that zeitgeist.
My mother was very much a 60s hippie, and she always used to say that the best way to understand the fundamental hopefulness of the 1960s is to watch Star Trek, because especially she would say this as we were watching the Next Generation, the 90s, which is very positive and I think has hope in it, but it doesn't have that fundamental sense of science is going to make everything better that it does. And I think you could probably do an interesting sociology class on America in the 60s versus America in the 90s just by looking at those two shows. So yeah, that's very true.
Better living through chemistry has a whole different...
We're going to do the sports ethics one. We'll get to that, I promise. You can have your Barry Bonds as your hero moment.
That's right.
There you go. He took a super serum, that's for sure.
I didn't say he's my hero.
Paul,
I said he's a real-life superhero. There's a difference. He did. So I've really enjoyed this. I don't know a ton about Star Trek. I hadn't really thought about the frontier in this exact manner, and I've enjoyed getting to explore that with the two of you, and the perspectives you're bringing. I did see the Borg movie. There's a movie, right, where they're the main antagonist is the Borg, and I enjoyed it. It felt kind of more like a horror movie than what I expect out of Star Trek a little bit, because they're a little bit of this "you will be assimilated," and I've always wanted to make, for the last 5 or 6 years, a T-shirt that says "Resistance is futile. The only solution is revolution." That's all I got. A non-violent, a quiet revolution.
It is a comment often made that
that's just a little bit of a play on the whole
Star Trek has been always
resist. I don't think that's enough.
It's never made the kind of money that Star Wars has. And probably the two most successful, movies are First Contact, which I think you're right, is very much, it has a lot of Star Trek themes, but still is in many ways a horror movie, and Wrath of Khan, which has very little to do with the normal Star Trek themes of exploration and encountering the new and ethical challenges. It's basically just a submarine movie. If you watch a World War II submarine movie and there's some conflict between the captains, that's Wrath of Khan. Wrath of Khan is very much not Star Trek. I think it's one of the best science fiction movies ever made. I love it, and it's hugely successful, but it's not. It's kind of different from Star Trek. I'll just close by also adding Buffy Bot further chimed in when we were talking about Uhura, that yes, she wasn't the captain and was also the Star Trek Smurfette, but glorified secretary is a few steps up from the maid, especially of the 60s. And I love the term the Star Trek Smurfette, and unfortunately that is so perfect for Uhura. And what I appreciate is that Star Trek has always tried to find ways to sort of recognize the critiques and go with it. And so, for example, you brought up the fact, Matthew, that in the 1960s, they were trying to push some things about gender equality, but all the women were in these miniskirts. So the first season of Next Generation, all of the lower-ranked officers are in miniskirts, including the men. Which is just sure. Yeah, never a named character, but it was just a fun little
Why not?
That's how they're going to try to do it.
This is just how the lower people dress. I feel like the phrase, like, who wears the pants on this spaceship or something.
I don't think you can exactly track when ratings week was in the Star Trek
I'm not sure
season for Next Generation.
Never mind.
By looking at when they go to the planet where the people have some very cultural, anthropological reason for not wearing clothing. But it was almost always during ratings week, so. Matthew, you had a last comment to make?
Well, say what you want about her, but remember, it's
I'll say the other things we can say about her is, we think about, like, her kissing Kirk shouldn't be a big deal, and whatever else you say about her character, numerous TV stations in the South wouldn't play that episode. So clearly it was a, like, real groundbreaker. And I love the way that, like, I don't love the J.J. Abrams Star Trek very much, but I think one thing he did was he said, okay, well, let's take Uhura's character and make her much more badass. And he gives her much more power and responsibility. So it's a way you can take that kind of thing and have it grow.
Well, to an extent, there's the people recently have been saying bad things about the new Star Trek, and they're saying, it was never so political and it was never so woke.
Yeah.
And the reason they're saying that is because the stuff that they were being political and woke about is just normal now. So they won.
Right.
They won. The fact that it's
I kind of would love to see if you could ever talk to Force Ghost Jack Kirby and have him deal with the fact that Marvel is all of a sudden woke. The Jew in 1941, before we're in World War II, writing a story about literally Jews creating a golem to go and punch Hitler. You could tell him that we won. I think he'd still want to punch everybody who thinks Marvel is now woke and wasn't. But I still like that image. So, well, thank you both. It's been a fantastic conversation. Matthew, we're definitely going to have you back on. But in the meantime, for people who are really intrigued, they want to read some of the stuff you've written or find other stuff you're doing, where can they look?
I try to avoid being online. I have a Facebook, but that's about it because I'm old. But if you just go to my webpage, which is MatthewKapell.com, you can see the stuff I've done, which, there's a couple of books on Star Trek that I've edited that are listed there.
I so appreciate a professor saying that.
But you can also always get them reused. I have to assign one of my own books this coming semester, so I'm going to walk into class on the first day.
I had a professor who would, because the books I read in grad school, they would reprint it every year, and they would change the pagination a bit, so that it would hard to figure out. And so she would say, I want you to read pages 20 through 27 in the 2015 version, but that would be pages 22 through 29 in the she just would do that to help out. So, and Paul, we've been doing all this on the Zen Madman Twitch stream, which one of these days we're going to get around to advertising more than 5 minutes before an episode goes up. But what is the Zen Madman up to?
Yeah, a lot of chess lately, which I've been looking at chess books, and they're actually somewhat reasonably priced. I was looking at the MIT Open Courseware a lot of times because I think, oh, maybe I'll study this, maybe I'll study that, and it's great that all these things are free online, but at the same time, then you look at the books you're supposed to get, and you're like, oh my goodness, so I think it's great to promote your own used books as well. I don't know. I'm tweeting. I'm playing chess. I'm playing poker. I'm doing things on various.
Awesome.
I haven't been making.
Well, thank you both so much. I will say to a listener who wrote in some great feedback
Twitch
about the Thor movie, I am going to read your feedback. Paul, as I understand, has not yet seen the Thor movie, so I just want to wait until that happens. But it should be going to the Disney Plus fairly soon. September 8th. Okay, cool. So we will get discussed because we did a great episode on Thor and Theodicy with a rabbi that I really enjoyed.
September 8th.
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad you enjoyed it. And I was give him a plug again, Pop Culture Rabbi on
That was
TikTok.
a great episode.
Great to check out. But of course, so we will get to that listener content, and we love more. So let us know what you think. What do you think of this whole concept that we're talked about? Are you a Star Trek fan? Do you hate Star Trek? Is this new ideas? Is this stuff you've been thinking about before? Let us know. You can find all the ways to contact us by going to theethicalpanda.com. There, of course, you'll also find all the other podcasts that I do, including Star Wars Universe Podcast, which Paul is a frequent guest on. We're going to get Matthew on there as well. Right now we're doing some stuff with the books and continuing our coverage of the TV show Rebels. We're getting really excited for Andor. Andor was supposed to be my birthday present. It was going to go live on August 31st, my birthday. It's been pushed back a few weeks, just gives us more time to get excited. I'm reading every book that has some relevance to it to try and get psyched up for it. So check out that. Check out this. If you haven't, please subscribe to both of these podcasts. And most importantly, as fans, be good to each other.